Questioning participants of the process. I am Rain from the 28th century. Previously, on Rain 28, we discussed how the suicide riots of 2100 in the Neo-Nipponese cloud colonies on Venus were ultimately a consequence of the C19 crisis. Wait, have I been mixing up timelines again? Here we aren't so far yet, right? Edit note. Cut this scene. Previously in this series we compared C19 to other pandemics. Now we will explore the possibility space of scenarios regarding the C19 situation. We'll take a look at the possibilities before weighing them with evidence to estimate their likelihood. Still, I'd like to add at least some motivation for the plausibility to each scenario. Since there are so many different theories surrounding C19, at first I will present a rough classification of pandemics. Not along the lines of severity, as measured by mortality or infection fatality rate, but along other important aspects: source, reaction, and utilization. Now some of you might wonder, will I discuss conspiracy theories surrounding C19? Yes, certainly. You really need to consider possible conspiracies in order to get a complete picture. Of course, you need to tread carefully here, since this is obviously very serious and potentially deadly terrain. I am well aware of the seriousness of the situation. But are you? What do we call an exposed conspiracy? An affair or a scandal? Exposing conspiracies is a part of what's known as investigative journalism. That kind of journalism has been somewhat in decline during the last decades. Note that I don't do this investigative journalism thing here. I just want to help you reach a higher level of mental clarity. Well, actually, I do want more, but I won't discuss that right now. Some of you might wonder to the contrary. Will I discuss the possibility that no conspiracy theory at all is at play here? Depending on how deep you follow the rabbit hole, this idea may seem absurd to you. Still, you need to stay open to all possibilities, no matter how unlikely they seem by now. I am quite aware how divisive this topic has become. That's why I feel the need to address it straight on. You stand at a watershed moment in history. The current C19 situation stands at the start of a transformation whose size you still cannot appreciate. By the way, I am also addressing you, Mr. Klaus Schwab. Let me explain to you the role of 2020. It's the official starting year of the cybernetic revolution. Now let's start with my pandemic classification. Source type. Where does the causative pathogen of a pandemic come from? There are 5 general possibilities. 1. Natural occurrence. The pathogen already existed in the wild somewhere, but got into contact with a larger group of humans somehow. Or it mutated and became deadlier or more infectious. Or it just accompanied us, but so far we didn't pay much attention to it. There is a quite recent example of the latter, Helicobacter pylori, which causes stomach ulcers. Before the discovery of that bacterium, nearly nobody thought that bacteria living in the stomach could cause such diseases. 2. Imported. The pathogen already existed in some region, but was then exported to other parts of the world by trade or migration. The first route was how the Black Death traveled from Asia to Europe, and the colonization of the Americas by the Europeans brought smallpox with it. 3. Bioweapon. The pathogen was spread on purpose in order to cause damage or panic. Anthrax is a prime example of a pathogen that has been used as a bioweapon. Note that the pathogen doesn't need to be technologically modified to be used as a bioweapon. If its natural form is severe enough, no further tampering with it may be needed. For a less dangerous pathogen, some degree of biotechnological modification may be needed to turn it into an effective bioweapon. Of course, the use of biological pathogens as means of warfare is outlawed by the Geneva Conventions, but that doesn't make their use very unlikely. The use of bioweapons can be concealed. It could be framed as natural mutation of an already endemic pathogen, for example. 4. Accidental release. Some labs have samples of dangerous pathogens. Although they usually have serious security precautions that prevent their accidental release, those precautions are never guaranteed to suffice. 5. Other source. The previous options should be comprehensive, but there's always the possibility that we just miss some outlandish way in which a pandemic may come to pass. So, this other source type is the catch-all type for these unknown unknowns kind of types. Reaction type. How do people react to a pandemic? Although the reaction to it can vary depending on time and location, there are 6 basic patterns. 1. Ignorance. People just don't bother with it. Perhaps because it has been hitherto unknown, like Helicobacter pylori, or perhaps it has been contained in wealthy countries like malaria, or because it has become something like a normal background event, like the seasonal flu. 2. Cover up. The outbreak is intentionally covered up for political reasons. This has been done with the Spanish flu globally, until the relatively free Spanish media reported about it, which is actually the reason why it's called the Spanish flu. Apparently this has also been tried with C19 during the initial outbreak in Wuhan. 3. Panic. People start worrying in a greatly exaggerated fashion about the disease. A decent example for a panic pandemic is BSE. This supposedly prion-based disease enjoyed a lot of media coverage, but luckily there weren't many cases of humans contracting the corresponding disease. 4. Hype. In a hype, a pandemic is given excessive attention and resources for its containment. The difference to the panic reaction is that the hype is caused on purpose, while a panic emerges naturally. Unfortunately, the distinction to the panic scenario is difficult, since proving the intentions of those who fuel the hype is hard. After all, they must just be caught up in a general panic just like anyone else. 5. Regular. The reaction to the pandemic is neither diminished nor excessive. Here it becomes obvious that this kind of judgment is very subjective. What is an appropriate reaction to a pandemic after all? What is a rational reaction to risks? Life is full of dangers, but for some we take certain precautions, while we tend to accept other dangers fully as necessary elements of our existence. At this stage, there are no right or wrong answers. It's up to your own judgment what you see as appropriate or not. 6. Other reaction. Some reactions might not properly fit into any of the categories above. A funny example of that is the party fever pandemic of 2457. It was spread in the Epsilon Indi star system as a prank. Party fever caused a massive release of endorphins and oxytocin, creating a peaceful party mood. Most people reacted to that with amusement and exhilaration. Never let a good crisis pass unused. You can apply that phrase to any crisis in general. For pandemics in particular, there are a couple of interesting use cases. 1. No use. We just see the pandemic as a problem with no positive use. That's a foolish position to take. No rational person should commit to that position. 2. Tech development. During a pandemic, there is the opportunity to push the development of certain technologies like vaccines, treatments, digital communication and collaboration tools, and so on. 3. Economic gain. Building on the tech development angle, certain businesses like pharma, telecommunication, digital entertainment and robots for example, should see a big spike in their turnover. That's exactly what we are seeing right now. 4. Cold War. Let's face the elephant in the room. China. China's political and economic system has been surprisingly successful over the last decades. So much so that it poses a serious threat even to the United States of America. It can be argued that we are already in a new Cold War, a Sino-American Cold War between the USA and China. Because both sides fear a hot war, all kinds of Cold War strategies are employed. Using bioweapons or pandemic scares are options that are quite attractive in such a Cold War scenario. Since both sides know that, they should take precautions for such attacks. Preparing for the use of bioweapons by the enemy, or them causing a pandemic hype, should be seen as necessary from a military perspective. Creating a pandemic hype may bolster the pandemic preparedness of both sides, which would protect the population from any serious pandemic caused by such bioweapons, but it would potentially also destroy a strategic advantage of one side having better offensive or defensive capabilities when it comes to biological warfare. The idea that C19 is an example of biological warfare or a preparation or prevention for such is rarely discussed. The reason why I bring this up is that in the future the main pandemic threat comes not from natural diseases but from engineered pathogens. The really smart people know about that, so they need to deal with that kind of potential threat. 5. Hot war. Bioweapons or pandemic scares can also be used in a hot war. The side with better defenses against such threats has an obvious advantage. Of course, C19 doesn't fit this particular use case unless you subscribe to the outlandish idea that the media are covering up an actually happening hot war. 6. Depopulation. Pandemics usually hit the sick, elderly and poor the hardest. A social Darwinist regime might therefore be happy about using a pandemic to get rid of undesired parts of the population. 7. Political transformation. A pandemic has a pretty good chance at destabilizing an entrenched political system. Systems that appear to fail at dealing with the challenges that the pandemic causes are disadvantaged, while systems that seem to control the pandemic threat well have an advantage. Authoritarian systems are usually seen as being better able to react to the challenges of pandemics, which is why a pandemic favors the transformation towards more authoritarian political regimes. Pandemics favor the centralization of power, unless they cause those central powers to fail catastrophically. 8. Deep war. The idea of a deep war is based on the notion of a deep state, which means a group of ruling elites that manipulate official state policy behind the scenes. A deep war is a war in which at least one side is a deep state faction. Depending on what side sees an advantage in deploying it, the pandemic or pandemic hype can be used to hurt the enemy side in a deep war. 9. Other use. As always, there's a fallback type for cases that don't fit into one of the previous categories. That could even be something as ludicrous as grannies being appreciated more for their cooking or baking skills, because people spend more time at home during pandemics. As you've seen, there are many types of ways to profit from a pandemic. That doesn't mean that any of the implied suspects has actually caused it. However, that's a possibility that needs to be explored on a case-by-case basis. Now, let's combine these types into a couple of different scenarios about what actually happened. Scenario 0. Baseline pandemic. In this scenario, the SARS-CoV-2 virus appears as natural mutation of a coronavirus somewhere in China. It is eventually discovered in Wuhan, where doctors know about a high-security bioresearch lab. They may suspect that an experimental pathogen may have escaped, so they are prone to see potential dangers even in moderately dangerous viruses. Eventually, they sound the alarm bells. To be safe, rather than sorry, the CCP locks down the Hubei province hard. At first, some parts of the world believe the virus panic is a fake. After the first serious infections in their countries, they realize that they have been wrong. They start believing the CCP. Since their lockdowns seem to have been quite effective, they copy that measure. Even if some governments have realized that they might have overreacted, they can't admit that, because that would cost them their power. Scenario 1. Biostrike. Knowing about the rise of China, the US government fears getting surpassed. Direct attack is out of the question, so they plan to attack China with a genetically modified SARS virus and try to make it look like an accidental release, or like the result of the horrible conditions in Chinese wet markets. The intention was to destabilize the CCP by hurting its economy through the combined burden of a trade war and a serious epidemic. Maybe it was not the US government that launched the attack, but a group of Secret Service agents that decided to go rogue, because they feared that the government wouldn't have the courage to do what they deemed as necessary to deal with the threat that China represents to the free world. What happens instead is that the plan backfires, because the virus turned out to be much weaker than expected, and because the Chinese countermeasures were surprisingly effective. That's why the rest of the world emulates them. After all, they may quickly realize that SARS-CoV-2 is a bioweapon with potentially devastating long-term effects. The media is told not to release that information, because a population that was convinced that the bioweapon had spread around the world would panic so much that an excessive amount of collateral damage would have been the consequence. Scenario 2. Hype attack. The CCP knew that the US would be likely to attack China somehow, so it launched a very unconventional preemptive strike. It simulated a virus outbreak in Wuhan, employing thousands of actors that pretend to be dying in the streets or in hospitals. The hospitals play along and produce fake numbers. That's also how the high effectiveness of lockdowns can be faked. At first, many countries, including the UK and the USA, suspect that the pandemic is a fake, so they don't take any serious precautions. Then, industry leaders get the idea that they could profit tremendously by jumping on the pandemic bandwagon. Big Pharma can make huge bucks by selling vaccinations. Big Tech profits by pushing the digital transformation. The financial elites are also in the game and know in which businesses to invest. Because those corporations are very effective at lobbying, and because parts of the political leadership are corrupt, the nation states that host those businesses start joining the pandemic hype. The mainstream media feed the hype because they are controlled by the financial elites. Other nations are motivated by international NGOs like the IMF to follow suit with the lockdowns. But they also know that they can't avoid the massive digitalization campaign that is going on around the world, and enforce lockdowns in order to create sufficiently strong incentives for a radical digitalization of the infrastructure. After all, they don't want to be left behind in a world in which total digitalization is a requirement for the entry to the market. Also, most nations embrace the pandemic because it enables them to act in a more authoritarian way, which is quite frankly very convenient for them. Scenario 3. Lockstep. In this scenario, there is a global network of powerful, corrupt elites. Let's call it the cabal. After many decades of observing China, it is confident that the political and economic model of that country is far superior for their own purposes than anything else. So they want to deploy that model to the rest of the world. The cabal owns the media and has control over lots of key politicians in the highest circles of most countries. So the cabal causes a pandemic hype through its agents in China. First, parts of the leadership of China resist, but they are soon convinced that the hype attack will work in their favor, so they play along. The cabal waits in other countries before it pushes the hype there, so that it looks like the rest of the world has more trouble dealing with the pandemic than China. This has the additional advantage of hurting the image of Trump, who knows that the pandemic is hyped and who tried to fight the cabal. That explains the timing of the pandemic hype. It is timed so that it hurts Trump during the year of his re-election efforts. The SARS-CoV-2 virus may exist, but it's merely the strongest of the currently existing coronaviruses, which nobody has bothered to research in detail before, because, like most coronaviruses, it almost only kills old people and those with serious preconditions. To make it appear lethal, a PCR test is used to find it, and excessive treatments are cooked up that happen to kill those cases which are hospitalized but would usually have survived. This creates the impression of a killer virus spreading around the globe. The larger purpose of the pandemic hype is to transfer more power to the cabal by implementing authoritarian but deeply controlled regimes in all nations. Because a free population is a threat to the cabal, the wealth of the middle class is eroded by lockdowns, while easily controllable mega corporations survive. I tried making all of these scenarios at least somewhat plausible. Of course, there are many possible variations of those 4 scenarios, but I think that these cover a large part of the ideas that are currently circulating about the C19 crisis. In the next video, I am going to present evidence for and against these scenarios. In addition, you might weigh in yourself and add some evidence for your favorite scenario. In fact, if there are more than 20 comments to this video within 14 days after its release, the best comment will be rewarded by me with 4 millibitcoins, a sum that is currently valuated at about $60 US. Understand deeply, act wisely, share subversively.